Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. We've got an oldie but a goodie that we'll be going through. We'll talk about HIPAA compliance and some of the trends happening out there in the medical world. We've got Grant and Andrew Ekstrom from Succurri. Hi, guys. How's it going?
Hey, Tony.
Good. How are you doing?
Good to see you again. One of the things that we're going to go through today in our conversation is about uh, some trends out there, and a lot of information, especially back in early 2023, 2022, where a lot of physicians, private practices were selling off to big conglomerates. But actually, there's some information that we can go over that can show you that the people who are opening up and going into private practice are a different breed these days. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll give you obviously the rundown of what HIPAA is. Everybody probably knows, so we'll just take a little snapshot there as a review. And then the majority of our conversation is going to be around compliance. Like, what is compliance? What does that mean versus actually a secure business? And we'll talk about that. And we'll end it up. We've got some cool videos to share with you, but also you can request a HIPAA checklist from Andrew at the end, and we'll make that connection all possible. So buckle up. We've got a good conversation going. Obviously, Succurri, we do a lot of different things in the IT world. All the way from strategy and annual reviews down to help desk stuff. But today, obviously, this is around IT security. And like all of our other webinars, we post these on our YouTube channel. So I want to put this up here. If you want to scan this and schedule a call or get information from Andrew, you can. That he's a virtual CIO at Succurri and for a lot of his clients. So I'll hold this up there for a second. And one of the things that caught my attention, was this YouTube channel from the American Medical Association. And they were talking to this guy, Dr. Mania, and he's a CEO of Mania Health. And he was really talking about how private practices, the doctors, the physicians that are running private practices are changing the way they do things and we've all heard comedians talk about the 10-page form you have to fill out every year when you go to the doctor. And it's like, why do I fill out this form? And so he was talking about how they just eliminated that. So a lot of kind of bloated practices out there. And what that really means is they're increasing their use of tech, which of course, when you do that, you've got to make sure that you're smarter with the information you're managing to be under HIPAA compliance, to have the actual security to make sure none of that information gets out there. But I just thought it was interesting, this conversation, and some of the things. If you look up his name, CEO Mania Health YouTube, Future of Private Practice, you'll come to this webinar. This is a link down here. But that being said, let's talk about what's actually going on, because Definitive Healthcare says that there are 338,000 physician practices in the US, private practices. The HIPAA Journal reported that, and this is 2023, that a little over 2% had data breaches of 500 records or more. Now, this is what was reported. So
I couldn't help myself.
Talk to me a little bit about, when I say the word reported and we kind of joke about it, why are we joking about it? What's actually going on, you think?
Yeah, I can take that one. So there's lots of different scenarios, right? So what is the definition of a breach? And that comes into question. What records were touched, what information was potentially seen, and so having somebody get into the network, get into account, in some cases doesn't actually constitute as a breach or data exfiltration. And so most insurance companies are looking for, did the data actually leave the network? And so, depending on who the owner of the company is, their legal counsel, their representatives from their insurance companies, they may not consider it a breach that is reportable. Um, Obviously, 2.14% of medical locations, it's going to be much higher than that have actually had account compromises, people getting into systems, and the definition of breach is kind of loose. So that's why we're seeing those numbers as low as they are, but it is significantly higher, and information is seen in most cases.
Yeah. Well, and has just been going up and up and up. Um, so let's just give a little rundown, real quick snapshot. HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, like I said, has been around a long time. Uh, Initially created to modernize how people used information in healthcare and making sure that your personal identifiable information isn't shared, isn't stolen, and is secure. So, anything you guys want to add to this? It's pretty widely known what this is about. And what I found interesting when we were talking about it was this idea of, well, you have HIPAA compliance, so the rule, the word of law, you know, compliance, and maybe this, Grant, when you look at the difference between compliance and actual security, I hadn't really thought about it this way until you guys were saying, hey, they're two completely different things.
Yeah, they're complementary, but they're different, right? And going back to what constitutes PII, those definitions have changed over the years also. So it used to be, something that was, people think about social security numbers or medical records and things like that. PII universally is considered any information that's collected during a transaction, right? And so that transaction could be an appointment. That transaction could be, even financial. So PII has got pretty broad in terminology. It could be your name and your address, and that's now considered PII and reportable, right? So it used to be a lot more information, so that's something to take in consideration. But yeah, so back to your compliance versus security. So compliance is a roadmap of getting to security. It's like a list of best practices and controls, versus security is pretty black and white. Either you are or you aren't secure in these specific areas. I always laugh because I've had many conversations with compliance officers about, which one overrules the other, right? And the answer is neither one of them do. Business rules the ruling on what happens, and it's based on risk, right? So compliance is a governing body that's telling you these are the things that you need to have in place to be able to operate, versus security is a business risk methodology, and you're ultimately fixing problems that you have with your organization by putting security controls in associated with the risk that you're willing to accept. So higher the risk, obviously you want to have a well implemented security control. Low risk, maybe something minimal or no control at all.
So when we say, looking at the controls or auditing the controls you have in place, the controls are actually the steps you take, the things you do with your information to make it secure, to make it safe, that's what a control is.
Correct. Yeah. So think of like controls, like having multi-factor or having passwords that are complex. That would be a form of a control, or having delegation of duties would be a control. And compliance addresses those types of controls, but there isn't necessarily you know a very very clean line of what control or what product you have to use, or necessarily even how effective that control is. Compliance is about saying you have something, you're able to, and there's different levels of maturity in compliance as well. So you might have something, but you don't have it documented, and you might have something undocumented, but it's not repeatable. And then you might have something that's documented, repeatable, and you might be looking at it from time to time. And so there's these different levels of maturity for each control, and that's how you're being judged on in a compliance perspective. But compliance is, almost up to the auditor itself. The guidelines for compliance tend to be pretty vague, and then the auditor is what's determining how compliant you are to those frameworks. I think it was like the
So,
auditor is like a judge almost, right? The law is written, but it might be vague, and so you have to have somebody that's determining that for you.
and
And every
so,
auditor is different.
so when I mean, that's the scenario when you're talking audit. I mean, we have up here on the screen, so gap analysis. So here's the auditor says, well, here's the controls you have versus here's the ones that we require of you. Remediation is really, okay, well, what's your plan to close the gap? And then the part that I got tripped up, monitoring detection of violation. So part of a control is to make sure you're looking to see if you have been breached or if there is a violation of those controls. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, putting in multi-factor, but not actually looking to see if anybody's failing it, that doesn't really help you out a whole lot, right? So you have the control, but you're not actually looking to see if somebody's either not using the control or if the control is being taken advantage of. So yeah, so it's like I said, it's that maturity level of, you might have something, but if you're not monitoring it or even trying to improve it, you're at a lower maturity level.
Yeah, and Tony, before we jump over to security, just really quickly, because I think the compliance slide, like I get asked all the time about like what constitutes HIPAA compliance. And what I try and tell people is basically what's on the compliance side of that slide. I say you're HIPAA compliant when you do an audit, and then you have, which is usually done by a third party. And then you have what's called a gap analysis, where someone shows you the audit and they say, you guys are here and you need to be here. That's the gap. And they give you then a remediation plan, which is like, how do you squeeze that gap to be smaller? And then you're monitoring continuously. And then you basically do that process annually. So that's what HIPAA compliance looks like. It's a documented process. You do the same thing year after year. The first year is hard because your gap is big, but every year it gets a little bit smaller. And so, like, to give an example of the monitoring detection, because people ask this all the time, and like, if you're in a clinic scenario, and let's say you're you have multiple providers in the clinic, and you see different patient panels. So if a provider gets into that patient record and there's no real reason, right? They have not seen the patient, they're not updating a prescription, they're just browsing to see what everyone's business is. That's actually a HIPAA violation. So like my wife's a physician and we live in a small town, and like sometimes we want to know someone's phone number and it's not in the phone book. And I know her medical record has it. And I'm like, hey, can you just go pop in the EMR and get that person's phone number? She's like, absolutely not. Under any circumstance, can I look at someone's chart? That's not my patient, and I don't have a valid reason for being in there. And so what should happen in that situation is there's somebody monitoring who's accessing the charts and then detecting when a violation like that has happened. I mean, that's a really advanced example of like how you're monitoring, but that's ultimately what that means, is like,
I thought you were going to say they need to bring back phone books.
Yeah, no, I mean, like her EMR has probably everyone's address and phone book in town. So
to be fair, so does Google. So
yeah, well,
There you
But
go.
yeah, so like when I see people, when I talk to them, I'm like, if you're not doing these 4 things, then you're not HIPAA compliant. Now that
Right.
doesn't mean that you won't do okay in an audit. It doesn't mean that you haven't started. Like Grant mentioned, the auditors, like I will tell you that there's so much gray zone in an audit because the auditors have a ton of latitude. And so they determine what's good or bad. Like if I was an auditor, there'd be very like no one would pass. Everyone would get fines because like I'm the letter of the law kind of guy.
Yeah.
And so, but Grant and I watched these auditors go through and they barely grazed the surface. And we're like, that was horrible. Like that didn't even come close to the law. This guy's looking at where's his next donut coming from and like, how can he get out of here fast enough?
Well,
When
and I think that's a great with the segue into security, though, right?
Yeah.
And so you have an auditor that, like, depending on the auditor, you might get a different auditor every year. And so what you saw last year and what you requested to have, like a remediation plan for last year, you may get hit on 4 or 5 different new items that weren't brought up last year, but they were the same way, like nothing's changed. And so you're like, well, wait a second, nobody said anything about it before. And that's because the depending on the auditor, the mood, whatever, it changes things. And sometimes less is more in a compliance audit. So that's a conversation for a different day. But
let me ask you this. If I'm a doctor, I'd rather be secure than pass an audit. But if I'm actually secure from someone like Succurri or you guys who follow the letter of the law, if I'm actually secure, I'm probably passing the audit, right?
Well, it's a great question. Yeah. So security, I would say that security, if you go down security path, you're most likely compliant. If you go down the compliance path, you're less likely to be secure. And because security is very black and white, it is either you are or you are not. And so in the scenario where you implement security first as your methodology, it's really easy to go through and check all those compliance boxes because you have all of those things already set up and ready to go, versus the other direction of like, I'm checking boxes. Well, great, you're going through the exercise, but you're not really getting any benefit out of it from your business. And so I always tend to go the security side of things just because it crosswalks not just to HIPAA compliance, but to a lot of other frameworks as well that are recommended to use.
Right, right. Well, and what you guys are saying is when you're trying to make your business, make your practice more secure, start with the high risk areas first. And you've got a few listed here. Why don't you walk me through those?
Yeah, it's really important to go through a risk analysis and a gap analysis, obviously. The risk analysis will really point out where to focus, right? When you have this huge list of all these items that you have to address, a lot of people just shut down because it's so much. Where do you start? And so working through the low hanging fruit, the high critical, so like restricting admin access, right? That's one of the easiest things to do. It basically, there's no cost from like a licensing perspective to do it, and it solves so many problems right out of the gate.
So Andrew can't go in and get phone numbers because he doesn't have admin rights.
Well,
I'm joking. I knew you wouldn't do that. I know that, but
the example of admin rights, which I think is like, the practical experience is like 7 or 8 years ago, people who worked in computers like every day had admin rights to their computers. So they could install programs and do whatever they wanted. It gave them a lot of flexibility, but ultimately we had a lot of viruses we dealt with. And so, Grant came to me 8 years ago and said, we have to remove admin rights from these individuals so they can't make changes on their computers. They can only work within the scope of, their box of what their job is. And I was like, oh, people are gonna be really mad. They're gonna be a lot.
I feel them throwing darts at me now.
Yeah, no, they were really mad. And when we removed admin rights, viruses gone. Like it was like we dealt with at least 1 or 2 viruses a week. I don't know the last time we had a virus. Like without admin rights, there just wasn't that entry point. So I'm knocking on wood here. But so like what happened is a very simple change gave us like a tremendous value. And that's what these 3 things are, is like these are things you want to do. You get a lot of return to little or no cost. But they're not intuitive because you're like, oh, well, that makes my life harder because I don't have admin rights. You're like, yeah, but it makes it really hard for the bad guy to do something to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, malware software detection. So one of the things that I hear a lot is like, oh, I've got antivirus on my system. And they're like, I'm like, oh, well, what do you use? And they're like, I'm using big name free version. And the answer is that's not even an antivirus. Like if it's free, it doesn't count. And even like the signature based versions that came out, even 5-6 years ago, those don't count. You have to have a modern version of anti-malware system, mostly known as like XDR, MDRs. Those are the ones that are looking for things that do not exist. That where AI is starting to come into play, things are changing. The signatures, you can't keep up with them anymore. And we are even going down the path of what we call zero trust, of making a significant change in our mentality. It's the first time in my entire career that we've actually gone down it with full-hearted, where we don't allow anything to function unless we approve it. So it's a paradigm shift. That's a little bit higher level of maturity level, but it's the same concept of like, you have to have an effective control in place. And even some of the modern technology that's coming out is still not 100% effective. And so you have to continue to stay ahead of the game.
Yeah. And Grant, to comment on that, like, so Tony, when Grant said it's a paradigm shift, he's not joking. Like literally, this is the next version. It's what's beyond antivirus. And we're implementing it in our own office, which all these technicians understand what's going on. And everyone hates Grant again, right? Like, he's the guy who's preventing them from doing stuff. And we all understand the reason we're doing it. Like Grant said, with AI moving as fast as it does, things changing so fast, antivirus like almost can't keep up anymore. And so with a zero trust environment, it's only allowed to work if you allow it. So it takes some time to set up and you have to kind of stay on top of it. But what we're envisioning within 2 years, zero trust will be what everyone does. So we're trying to figure out how to do it ahead of time, get our customers in it. We also want to be prepped up before, the nasty AI bots start sweeping the world. If you didn't watch our weaponized AI webinar, I totally recommend you go look at our YouTube channel. That's makes your toes curl up after you hear that one. So yeah, so I mean, these are simple things. I mean, zero trust is not simple, but at least have antivirus that you pay for.
Yeah, and zero trust isn't a new concept either, right? It's been around forever. It's a little bit harder to implement, but the effectiveness is significant.
Hey guys, I've got a question that came in about cloud-based EMRs. If you want to take it now, we do have a time in the end for Q&A, but if you want to take it now, I can throw it out there. It's up to you guys how you want to do that. It basically
it's the next line item, so might as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. What about cloud-based EMRs that should have their own security in place? I think we talked about this too, where each system has their own things in place, but that you have to keep an ecosystem within your practice. So maybe address that.
So I'll maybe take the first part, and then Andrew, you have anything to add? Yeah. So what we're seeing with a lot of EMRs, practice management, is that they are seeing what's happening in the industry as well. And they're starting to use large companies like Google or Microsoft as forms of authentication, or at least an option to be able to do that. Being able to get centralized authentication is really, really important, because now you can you can use the same protections that you have for the rest of your platforms for your EMR, your practice management, whatever it might be. Obviously, not all systems are there yet. And so maybe, Andrew, you can maybe talk about dealing with the different individual systems.
Yeah, so to answer your question, I guess the first thing to be aware of is security comes in layers, right? It's like a stair step. So you have your computer, and then you have your account you log on to your computer with, and then you have like your internet security, and then you have your EMR, and then you have the account you log into in your EMR, then you have your patient records. And so when, like in our case, if we were to do a full-blown audit, we would look at every single step and try and figure out what's going on. that gets to be kind of complex and overwhelming. But from a practice, like from a practitioner standpoint or practice manager standpoint, what you're going to want to look for in a cloud-based EMR and any EMR at all is one, everyone has a unique account. So like no one shares accounts to log in. Everyone has a password that can be reset like automatically on a regular basis. It doesn't have to be totally frequent, but you can do that. Length of password is a huge thing. So the longer your password is, it's every character of your password length makes it exponentially longer to crack. So if you have a password that's like 8 characters, it probably is cracked within like a day. If you have a password that's
it's less than that, it's like 5 minutes now.
Okay. But if you have a password that's like 14 to 16 characters, it takes a long time to crack it. And you have to have a much higher level of technology to do that. And so what we're telling people is you use a passphrase. Like my passphrase, this isn't what I use, but this is the example I tell people. Like my dog's name is Koa, he is black. And it's easy for me to remember. Maybe I threw a few special characters in there, but it's really long and it's not anything you can find in a dictionary. So that would be one thing is long passwords. Another one is, and not all EMRs have this, but you really want them to, and so I would hold them to the fire, is multi-factor authentication. So the person logs in, they have to put their password in, and then they get prompted for the code or the push or whatever it is, so that there's that second layer. If you don't have that second layer and you have a cloud-based EMR, you're basically an open target for someone to continue to try and hammer at the EMR. So the second part of this is you want your accounts to lock after a certain amount of failed login attempts. So at the very least, if there's someone trying to get into one of your accounts from the internet, that if they fail 5 times or whatever it is, the account gets locked out and someone has to go take a look at it. Those are the basic things. Cloud-based EMRs have a lot of really good benefits, and I could spend like a whole webinar talking on those. But the things you're going to look for from a cloud-based EMR are, do you have some sort of business associates agreement with them, or something that shows that they have a chain of custody, right? Because if there's a breach of your EMR, you as the owner of the practice are part of that chain of custody, and everyone's going to come to you to get their payout. So you want to make sure the EMR provider is engaged in that chain of custody. So they
have custody is who owns what information when. Is that what that means?
Yeah. So basically a chain of custody would be is you have your patient record and you as the provider are ultimately responsible for it. And every person that touches that record on behalf of you as the provider is part of that chain of custody. And each link in the chain is what's called a business associates agreement. So it makes sure that everybody has signed an agreement saying they will participate in the risk, the protection of that patient record. And so like there was a question asked of one of our centers of influence who I work with a lot about virtual assistants and chains of custody in healthcare. We'll chat with that one a little bit later, but ultimately, anyone who gets into the EMR should have a business associates agreement, unless they're your staff. And then there's basically you deal with that by having a signed staff agreement. But if you have outside vendors, if you have VAs or companies with VAs, you want them to have a business associates agreement. You want your EMR vendor to have a business continuity plan, which means that if something goes wrong, like they have an earthquake or a storm, they have a plan to get you back up and running. That's a HIPAA requirement. And then also you want to know where their backups are going. So, how long do they keep a backup? And if you ask Microsoft, they're like, oh, we got you backed up. And you say, okay, I want to go back and like from last month. They're like, oh, but we only backed you up for a week. So, it's the devil is in the details on those kind of things.
Interesting. Well, I hope that answered your question out there. We'll have a little time later to circle back if you need to re-ask. So we put together a mini little checklist, kind of like, hey, if these are the things that you should look at first if you're not looking at them. And you might have gone through those. But Andrew, maybe talk about how to think about HIPAA in your practice?
Yeah, so I get asked this question a lot. People come to me and say, this is really overwhelming. Maybe they've gone to the website for the National Institute of Standards and they've downloaded the spreadsheet that has all of the HIPAA, we call measures, but basically a measure is like, what are you doing, right? They're measuring your effectiveness at being secure. And there's usually like, I think we put 179 controls or measures. And so that's a lot of lines of questions, right? There's 179 questions that you have to answer. Usually you have to go out and find information. You have to ask your IT people, you have to ask your staff, and then you compile all of that. And that's what is your audit. That's the basis of your gap analysis. And most people are like, I've already worked 10 hours a day. I don't have time for this. I'd like to spend some time with my family. So what I like to say is start by starting. And so the 5 elements here are the things that are like inexcusable if you don't do at least an attempt at them. So what's your firewall? So the firewall is the device that protects your business from the internet. You can have that at your internet connection. You can have a firewall on your computer. You need to know what that device is, specifically like the manufacturer and model number, and you need to know who manages it. So if you have an IT person that generally is the person you'd ask to give you that information, you may have bought one at Best Buy, and that's okay. Just go look at the manufacturer and model number, at least know what it is. The next one is
security side makes me cringe. Sorry.
What's that?
I said the security side of me made me cringe a little bit.
No, I know.
By the firewall at Best Buy. Nothing to do with compliance, just security. Sorry.
No. The next one is know what your antivirus software is, and I would say know how it's deployed. Like we talk about, just because you bought software doesn't mean it showed up on every computer. So, you may have to ask your IT person, your office manager, like, is antivirus software on every computer? And like Grant mentioned earlier, free doesn't usually cut it. So you may pass an audit the first time, but after that, they're going to tell you to buy the software.
Or how about I'll raise my hand, the DIY disaster of antivirus software, where you try to do it yourself and you're like, it's just a web of craziness for the untrained. And trying to get away with, I don't have to pay, I can make this work. Yeah.
Well, and a lot of the stuff I see nowadays is, do you have a centrally managed antivirus?
Yeah.
And so that's the key there. So, right, you can't just go around and have individual systems that have their own configurations. You have to have it managed from a centralized location. So that's pretty important.
Yeah, and that goes back to one of the previous slides where you're doing monitoring and detection. To monitor, you have to have a central place you can go look for it. And so that's usually the recommendation. What's your backup solution? So this is dual-sided. Once again, it's like there's an entire section in the spreadsheet that HIPAA requires for backup. There's like 20 questions. So know where your backup is. So just a side note, little funny story. We have a customer that we brought on, and the CEO of the company was a little concerned about backups, and ultimately, came to us and said, hey, can you guys be an outside resource for us? And we said, sure. Like, what is your backup solution? And he said, I don't know. I can tell you as a CEO or an owner of a company, that is one thing you want to know, because when the stuff hits the fan, the first thing you're going to ask for is the backup. You do not want your IT person saying, oops, I didn't look at it and now it's months back. And so this specific customer actually called us a week later and said, okay, oops, there was a failure and we lost the system and our last backup was September. And I was like, and we didn't manage the backups. So we had it was a tough conversation, right? Someone lost their job over it. It was, so like, if you're going to do one thing, make sure you feel very comfortable as a business owner of how your data is being backed up. And I would say have your IT professional show you how to log into the system so you can actually see and verify that it's getting backed up where you expect it to.
Or at least have reports that are on a daily basis letting you know. I'm like, you might look at it as an annoyance that you're seeing an email, but at least you have the ability to go back and look that stuff's happening. And going to the hand on the security side is, if you think about backups and how important they are worst case scenario tools, right? And so even if you have all these other controls in place, if they all fail, at least you have your backup. You can still restore. If you don't have your backups, that's it. Shut your doors.
Yeah.
Maybe get some insurance money, maybe, but you're done, right? So backups, while sometimes in the IT mindset is like, oh, I'll get to that, right? And that's the worst mindset to have. Backup should be the first thing you get to, and then the rest of the controls come into play after that.
Yeah. And like in our business, when we were small, we had to divide our time with our technicians doing like checking backups and doing like day-to-day IT tasks, which is probably very similar to what like most individual IT providers would be at a small practice, or if that was an individual like IT professional that was employed. And, doctor can't get into EMR, can't see patients is way higher priority than, oh, is the backup running, or, oh, I've got a problem with it, I'll get to that. And so I've watched it happen so many times. And we got to the size where we had so many backups we were managing. We now have a full-time professional. That's their only job, is to watch the backups, because Grant and I don't have time to watch them. And so we need somebody who we can go to and say, when there's a problem, he's the canary in the coal mine. So know your backups, be very comfortable with them. The other thing I would tell you is, if your backups go on a USB stick or a hard drive that you have in hand, if you're not taking those home yourself, you are putting your business in somebody else's hands, and they don't care as much about your business as you do.
Well, to even add on to that, so I always discourage doing backups on portable devices. Two-part deal. One, the moment that a human being has to have interaction into a backup process, you have a 50% failure rate. Just the way it is. Like, the chances of you restoring are 50% the moment a human being gets involved. The second part is that hard drives that are USB or USB sticks have a higher failure rate than the hard drives that are in your computer. They're cheap. They're designed to be cheap. They are not like, oh, I'm going to put that in my safe and I'll get it out when I need it kind of thing. Don't have any expectations that you're going to be able to restore from that backup. Having a true backup scenario in place where you're at least doing a cloud backup at bare minimum, where you're backing it up offsite, it's happening automatically and you're just getting notified when things are going wrong. The best case scenario is the rule of three, where you have your backups on site and in the cloud, and your backups are on a separate network than the rest of your production environment. So making
you're bleeding into the last item.
Hey, I love the segue, right? Business continuity. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, really in testing all of this too, which goes to the business continuity, is you have to take a look to see if something actually does happen. Are my backups adequate to get me up and functioning? And on top of that, how long does it take for me to get up and functioning? That's a real key, because I think in a lot of practices, the tolerance for downtime is damn near nothing, right? And so if you have backups that are only in the cloud and it takes you 3 weeks to restore, that might be a practice killer, right? So understanding how long it takes to get up and going again through your business continuity plan and testing your plan is really, really important.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting to me is these in these key elements here, it says HIPAA on there, but it's really about security, and
it's like about best practice. This is just business best practice.
I was going to say, so it's like running any kind of business. We're just happening to talk about healthcare, but any kind of business, you need to have people that are owners that drive this. And the best part about, working with Succurri, I think, is you guys care about this stuff. You're going to be proactive in thinking about this stuff. You're not going to get lazy with it. You're going to do enough of the right things to handle even above and beyond what a normal business owner is probably capable of thinking of. And that is like having, I think, it's as good as having like another really good physician on your team, or it's as good as having a practice manager who's organized to the hilt. Having the right people on your team is part of that. And so if you are kind of trying to skate by, I guess it works until it doesn't.
Well,
that's the key. Yeah.
Yeah, and I will say there's an exercise I walk my customers through. Actually, if you go back to the previous slide for the business continuity plan, so we have a large engineering customer. They have about 65 employees, 3 locations, and they had a pretty significant power outage. It was out for 2 days, and so they didn't realize in their business continuity plan the cost. So we went through and we did this exercise of calculate your staff expense for an entire day, calculate your overhead, like just run, your lights, whatever it costs you to keep the doors open, calculate what you would have lost in billable hours, and then add that together. And that's what your burn rate is on every day that you're out down. And so they had never, no one likes to do that. It's a boring exercise. But when we did it, when they had their power outage, so they have a burn rate of $20,000 a day. And when they had a real day that they couldn't do work and they missed all that billing and they had all that expense, they came back and said, I never thought of it that way, but like we can't afford to be down. And so when you have a $20,000 budget a day, you can buy some amazing IT systems to keep you up and running and really prevent that from happening again. And that's where the business continuity plan comes in, is you just go through the exercise of, how do I get back up and running? What does it cost me? What is required to do that? That generally requires a company like us to go through that because we know the steps that are ahead because we've done this, several times. But you have a plan in place. You can Google business continuity plans though, and watch YouTube videos. It'd be very easy.
Yeah, I think practical is the word I'm looking for. The other thing is I know that there are business owners, physician and otherwise, but that are out there kind of going, oh, wow, I'm curious. I wonder what our burn rate is.
Yeah.
As soon as you walk through that and told me about it, it's like,
scary.
Oh, well, I'm sitting in front of the TV. Let's do some penciling, of that. And it probably would shock people. The other thing I know is that not everybody has a burn rate of 20K a day. And so this word practical, what's the reason why I love you guys is because you say, oh, well, this is your business. This is the stage of your business. This is where you're at. We're going to give you the maximum of what that business can afford to get you the best type of security, the best type of IT support that business should afford, because not everybody can afford the best, right?
We don't need a $20,000 budget to make things work, right?
Yeah,
and that's why it always, if you sit down and understand it, it always pencils out to put the insurance. And when I say insurance, the right things in place, the business continuity, because that's what it is. It's business insurance. It's just not somebody paying you money. It's just ensuring that you're able to get up and going again. It always pencils out when you realize how much you'd spend if you didn't have it and something disastrous happens.
Make sure you have the right controls in place, really.
Yeah, and tabletop it, right? You do an exercise of what, it's not only just are these things in place, it's like, what are the little things that happen in the process of getting up and going, right? If you don't tabletop, you have no experience in what's going on. And I think a lot of companies, in the last 2 weeks really figured out that they should have probably tabletopped if a vendor takes you down, that what is that going to look like, right? So we had nationwide outages for all sorts of different services for an entire day and more. Nobody realized how bad it could really be. And so understanding and going through that process of how bad it could be, the people that did tabletop the exercises came out and said, okay, this is what we're going to do. They put it in motion and they go, versus a bunch of people running around like chickens with their head cut off trying to figure out what just happened, right? So it's really important to go through the exercise.
And Grant, just so I understand, tabletop, when you say the tabletop, the nomenclature there is run like a test, a simulation. Is that what you mean?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And, so CrowdStrike, obviously the outage,
I wasn't going to say the name. I don't, no lawsuits,
everyone knows
we'll bleep that out.
Yeah, everyone knows. So
if it happens to you, your name should be said, right? This isn't Harry Potter and Voldemort kind of deal. This is like stuff.
The thing about that is that, and I think you mentioned this, Grant, is it was probably the worst cyber event in history. Like the cost is in billions of dollars of burn rate. And it was not malicious. It was an accident, right? And so what would have happened if it was malicious and maybe driven by AI where it could adapt?
Game over. Game over. Lights out. Game over for everyone.
Yeah, we would still not be flying. Thankfully, I fly Alaska Airlines and I had to fly the next day and they didn't use CrowdStrike. So I got to go to where I needed to go. But I was watching their website all day long, like, oh my gosh, is this not going to happen for me? But yeah, so like, I guess what it's be practical. So, to talk about this slide a little bit, like this is the one thing, if you're coming to this webinar, this is the one thing, and I'm going to use my disclaimer. This is educational purposes only. This is not a paid consulting engagement. This is not implying a relationship, that we're advising you legally on things. So now that I've said that, I'm going to tell you what I tell my customers behind closed doors. Like we have small medical practices that we go through and we have individual conversations about this sort of thing. And when we have these conversations, the first thing that comes up is, one, it's expensive to do a compliance audit. Two, the results that come from that cost money to fix. Three, they're busy. They don't have a lot of resources to dedicate to it. And so they asked me, like, what can we do? And so ultimately, it comes back to that practical approach. And so, like I said, this is not me advising you in any way. I'm just telling you this is how I would go about it if I was in your shoes. Getting audited is really, it's very, like, it doesn't happen a ton. There's certain, I've come across a few specialties that get audited more because they have, like, they do tests or human trials or things, and they're being audited constantly. But like their traditional primary care businesses, family practice, pediatrics, geriatrics, the specialties that don't have trials, they don't get audited very often. So the risk of actually getting audited is really low. So if you spend all your resources on something where you get very little value back from, which would be like the compliance, the HIPAA compliance, right? Your audit, your gap analysis, your remediation plan, your resources are ultimately consumed in something you don't get value back from. Versus if you spend your resources on security, you're going to get value back because the likelihood of you getting breached is extremely high, and it gets higher every single day. The likelihood, if you are breached, you are going to get a call from Health and Human Services, and they're going to want to know what's gone on. So, and then they're going to ask for your compliance documentation. So if you don't get breached, the likelihood of anyone coming to bug you or it getting out of your own hands is much lower. So what we do for our customers is we say, let's focus on the security. So you're getting double the value. You are not getting breached, most likely, or you're minimizing it dramatically. And you have a lot of the controls that compliance wants you to have in place. So when they do come in, even if you don't have the paperwork, they can start checking boxes really fast. And so whatever, slap on the hand you're going to get is a much smaller thing. The other part of this is if you don't have the security controls in place, and let's say you have a cybersecurity insurance policy, they're not going to pay out. And
right.
Like if you missed our cybersecurity insurance policy video from a few weeks ago, it was really, really good. We had an expert from the insurance industry on talking through that, and ultimately, not all policies are created equal. So I would say go to our YouTube channel and watch that one. I thought, like, I learned a ton of stuff from that. But ultimately, what I'm saying here is prevent the breaches, and you're getting value from it. So for us, when we realized that was the end goal for a lot of our customers, is like, let's just prevent the breach. Grant came to me and he said, this is like a very complex process to get all the things in place to be really effective and safe. How do we do this? And so, I said, I'm not the expert. You're the CISSP. So he went out in the industry and he found a bunch of vendors and he packaged them up. And so we have like basically one package that our customers can buy. They write us a check. It puts in place like 10 really effective tools and controls, and their likelihood of a breach goes to way down.
Sorry, correction on that. Sorry, one correction. It implements closer to like 125 controls.
Okay.
With 10 different tools. So when you go back and looking at like the 175, the controls that it does not implement are based on controls that we can't actually implement for you. So that's like clean desk policies, that's implementing of training programs and enforcing those. Those are the ones that are a little outside of our wheelhouse. But the security package basically covers and crosswalks just about any security framework that you think of, including HIPAA.
Bringing up these other conversations, we've talked to cybersecurity insurance experts. We went through a whole conversation about AI used to infiltrate networks and stuff like that. And now we're talking about regulation. And on one hand, you're like, well, they don't really monitor it very well for a lot of these physicians, but if you get caught and you have insurance and think your insurance is going to pay for it, it won't.
It's like cheating on your taxes, right?
Completely. And
they're going to get you.
The least expensive thing to do is prevent the breaches.
Yeah. Well, and you get the benefit.
Your way out from there.
Yeah, you get the benefit of securing your company, which should really be the major focus. And over the years, I always came across many misguided individuals that their concern was about being compliant and checking the boxes without, right. And you get no value out of that. It's just a governing body telling you what they want to see, right? The real benefit comes from actually being able to secure your own company, and then compliance comes with it, right? So you're much, much closer to compliance when you've gone the security route.
Yeah, and what we're seeing unfolding, so like basically when we talk with our customers, they said, we can write you a check. Like if you guys can bring us like 75, 80% of the way down the road with security, we'll write you a check. And so we figured out a way to do that that's, very reasonable per employee, or like, it's kind of a little matrix, but employee, number of computers and so forth. And they just write us a check and we take care of that. And so that's what I would really recommend is like, you want to outsource that to someone who's an expert at it and just get them to take care of it. You write a check, it's part of your budget, you get to have all those controls. I actually sent Grant a message this morning as I was looking at a cybersecurity insurance policy application. This is just the application. And now they're like 4 pages long. I have to read it for content because they're asking really specific questions that IT has to answer. And in this one, they actually are requiring compliance now. It's not just, do you have passwords? Do you have multi-factor? It's like, do you have a structured annual a compliance review that you go through, and who's responsible for it? It was like, it is very close to what HIPAA dictated. And I was like, this customer will never get this insurance policy. I actually gave them a reference to to Maria, who's from the cybersecurity insurance webinar, and said, give her a call because she'll probably find you a policy that's more appropriate for you guys, which is like, they're a utility that doesn't have like patient records. So, so ultimately what I'm saying here is compliance is like going to become a thing. And I sent Grant a message and I said, this this application is showing that like Succurri has to probably get into the business of compliance as a service, where we can have like a fee we charge customers and we just continuously do the compliance for them. And it's not like a one-time deal where we're always meeting those controls. So I've really held off on it because it hasn't been high technology, which is what we're used to. It's always been like, oh, that's a lot of paperwork. So, but it looks like it's
insurance
happening.
Companies are paying attention, and they're going, "Oh, breach is on the way up."
Well, yeah, because they're paying out, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Follow the money. Yeah, and so obviously you heard it here first, where Andrew is introducing products out to the wild, but it is true. So compliance, like going back to most compliance, have very similar frameworks, and so if going down the security route gets you almost 90% of the way there, but being able to get that extra 10% is really difficult. And having systems in place and professionals like ourselves to be able to help track and give guidance on those different types of mechanisms that you have to put in place, the controls, it's really important, because otherwise you just get lost, right? It's just an endless list of things that you don't have time for. And so being able to have somebody that's basically the captain of the ship and is saying, okay, I need a policy from you that tells me about X, Y, and Z. Right. I can't tell you what policies are part of your business, right? I might have a template and you have to adjust it to your company, but ultimately I'm the one who's making sure that that information comes back and gets put into that package. And so that's where that compliance as a service comes down the path, is being able to have somebody quarterback that process for you. Yeah. And it's not, it's not just a write a check and you don't have to do anything at all, right? You still have to be engaged in the process, but we'll get you across that finish line.
Yeah, it's like anything else that's important in your business. It's still your business, but if you have the right people that are helping lead certain areas of your business that are proactive about it, it becomes easier to engage as a business owner on those things that are critical. So we're coming up on time. I want to make sure we let Andrew plug his 2 videos here, because we just tapped the surface in this conversation. So there's a couple of YouTube videos out there on the channel, and these go right to the videos, these QR codes. And one thing I should probably do is put our YouTube channel out there so that people will see it.
It's really easy. You just go to YouTube and you search Succurri, which is spelled in the top corner. So these 2 videos actually they started by an invitation from our friend Carlene Sue from the Rheumatology Private Practice Alliance. Carlene invited me to speak at her conference last year in LA. And so part 1, I actually did a whole hour on stage, talked with a bunch of rheumatologists about, kind of a deep dive, right? So after that, I came back and there were some other folks in the medical community that I know, and they're like, oh, we really want to hear that presentation. I'm like, okay, so I'll re-record it. So I recorded this one, and then part 2 with my wife, who's the physician. She has Uncluttered Mind MD. And so part 1 is like a deep dive into HIPAA and compliance. It is an hour. And actually, I may have gone over it. There's so much to talk about, but it's really educational if you're not that familiar and you want more than what we gave you today. Part 2 is kind of like, this is HIPAA and then what we're seeing coming down the pipeline. So we talked a lot about next generation threats in that and next generation tools. So like basically every tool that Grant talked about in our advanced managed security package that we sell customers, I went into detail. Like I basically gave away the farm. So it's like, I said, this is what you need to have. This is how you implement it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
years of work. Just silver platter. Here you go.
Yeah. So we did both of those. Those were in the fall and like early winter. And then those kind of kicked off our whole webinar series. So if you do go to the YouTube channel, there's going to be a webinar on cybersecurity insurance, which I referenced earlier. I highly recommend you watch it. It's very educational. Also, the webinar on weaponized AI. This is like, it's on the horizon and it's way away, but like it will become a real problem. So we want you to be prepared for it. We tell our story of how weaponized AI ripped through our very secure data center in like a half an hour, and it owned us. It was thankfully a test we set off, but it has radically shifted how we are doing security. So I recommend you watch those. And every month we tend to post new content. So if you're interested, get on our mailing list. We'd love to have you join for our different webinars.